If someone today, a young performer or an old performer, wants to try and become popular, what do you think they ought to do?
I would say that two different things. One is they should do what they want to do in the music that makes sense to them. There's no point in trying, at least in early stages, trying to adapt your music to what you think other people might want. Other people will come along and tell you what they want, and you might have to deal with that because there might be other members of your band. Or, once you get involved in any sort of contracts, you're going to get into arguments about what you should be doing. But I think an old grizzled professional can possibly sit down and write an instant hit. But I don't think a 16-year-old could do that, and it'd be silly if they could. I mean, that's not what's going to make them appealing. In the end, what's going to make them successful is that they have a voice or a vision or a sound that people find interesting. So, first of all, I think they should just do what they want to do. But the second thing is I think they also should realise that they're very unlikely to be able to make a living just doing what they want to do. In the old-fashioned rock model, where even then most rock musicians didn't make a living, but the notion that you can become an artist and make your own music and sit back and a record company will sign you and they'll sell records and you get the royalties. You're going to have to do an awful lot of other things to make a living. You're going to have to do a lot of live playing, which, musicians, as in the whole history of musicians have always had to have what nowadays is called in the trendy term portfolio careers. But I mean, musicians have always had to be ready to play weddings or, to go in a studio when somebody wants 2 seconds on a documentary film or whatever it is. So the other thing I'll say to young musicians is develop all the skills you possibly can. The skill of playing by ear and the skill of reading. Understand your instrument perfectly. Understand and get some proper knowledge of how technology works and how recording works and all the other devices you're going to have to use, because you want to make sure your decisions are still happening there rather than just handing them over to somebody else.
Simon, you've been chair of the Mercury Music Prize judging panel since its inception in 1992. What is the Mercury Music Prize?
It's essentially a marketing tool. It was invented or thought up by an executive in Virgin Records who'd been responsible for the series that's still flourishing called Now That's What I Call Music Volume 1. So he was a kind of expert in thinking about how to sell music. And the concern they had in 1992, which is not at all what they would have today, is that music had traditionally from the 60s, so for the previous 30 years really, popular music been thought of as essentially a youth medium. And all the ways in which you sold music were essentially aimed at young people, like teenagers and young 20-year-olds. And that's how the basic press like New Musical Express, NME, worked. That's how Radio 1 worked. And what the record industry began to realise was that you now had a generation of people who'd grown up buying records, but who were no longer the targets of selling when new music came out, so had no knowledge of it or interest in it. So you had a kind of huge untapped market for interesting popular music that they would like, but they just never heard it. So it was thought if you could get a prize which had some sort of credibility in sort of artistic or musical terms, then and aimed to reach that slightly older audience. So their model was the Booker Prize in books. So you get these records publicised in record shops, and you get a different sort, and you'd get a different sort of audience reached. So the idea was that you'd be drawing attention of interesting music to a kind of older audience, an older audience which did love music and had always bought records. So that was the starting point.
And what would you say about the current crop, the 2016 nominees of Mercury Music Prize, nominees?
Well, I would say that ever since I've done it, I think that the standard of music in Britain is extraordinary, and I don't think there's any sense of decline or music not being what it used to be or any of that thing. So every year I'm always surprised by how much good music there is, and we have 12 records, we could easily have 24, or we could have another 12 the following week if the judges met a different week. I suppose the other thing I would say, which again is very evident this year, is that, and this comes back in a sense to what you want to do as a popular musician, I don't think musicians have divide up their notion of the market in the way that record companies or radio stations do. They don't think of themselves as, I am a something musician. And what they are is they make music, and they kind of start with a certain sort of genre, but they draw things from all over. So, for example, in the last 10 years, what's become interesting to me is not just that you now get popular electronic musicians coming out of the kind of DJ tradition, but how many other musicians, including folk musicians, now start integrating electronic effects or approaches into their music, so that you do get a sense that British musicians, and obviously I don't listen to enough American to know how parallel, but it all seems to me very British, have this very strong sense of experimentation, a strong sense of drawing on certainly historical models, but other kinds of music too. And particularly it reflects a kind of multicultural nature of Britain, and just in terms of the kind of different musical roots that people might have. So I think this year is an interesting year because it's clearly dominated by David Bowie, which I think for me is interesting, because I think the first piece of rock journalism when I became a kind of regular rock journalist I wrote must be in 1972, and my first column was about David Bowie and T-Rex as the kind of emerging sort of different ways of kind of glam pop. So I find it quite satisfying that David Bowie should be on my last Mercury shortlist. And I do think it's a wonderful record, but it means that's it was so much a record that meant a lot to a lot of people. But it's a slightly different record from one we've ever had on the prize, in a sense that it's both somebody who's not new, but a record that does seem of its time in a funny sort of way, and partly in the other, the sad way that it's of its time because it's the time when David Bowie died. So it has it doesn't fit in the way in which other ones do. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing is clearly we got 2 grime records on, which is another very loose term, at Kano and Skepta. And again, I think that reflects the fact that is now, in a funny sort of way, one of the mainstream sounds of British popular music. But it's a mainstream sound that would not be familiar to many old rock fans, for example. So I think, as I said at the beginning, I think the demographic problem these days for the music industry is not what it was in 1992. I think now they're more worried about young people not getting into a record buying habit. So they're more interested in how the Mercury could actually help people think about music who are sort of younger generation, and I think the kind of presence of grime artists reflects record industry. I mean, it reflects judges' views, but it also reflects, in a sense, the sort of music that's now seen as significant.
And what sort of impact does winning the Mercury Prize, or what sort of impact can it have on artists and performers?
Well, there's two different processes. There's getting onto the shortlist or the list of records of the year. That can have a huge impact for people who are in the minority or specialist genres like folk or jazz, because they're not selling very many anyway, and that can suddenly bring them an attention in the mainstream media they wouldn't normally get. So it gets far more people listening to them. In the early days, which was pre-digital, I mean, when the Mercury Prize started, we still got, it was quite early on in the history of CDs, and I've still got a collection of cassettes from the first 2 years of Mercury, which seems odd to me now. But in those days, if you read the paper and you saw that this was the Mercury shortlist, the only way you could find out what they sounded like basically was going to a record shop and listening to them or buying them. Nowadays, you can instantly go onto Spotify or whatever and listen to one track and decide you don't like it, and that's it, which goes back to that problem of people not wanting to listen to something they're unfamiliar with. So I think it has much less effect on record sales in that direct sense. It still has some effect, but it has a major impact still on people's public presence, and therefore how many people go and see them live. So it has a big transforming effect. Again, it's most noticeable in genres like folk or jazz, where people suddenly find themselves having much bigger audiences wanting to come to their shows. For the winner, it depends a little bit on if you have a winner. Say when Arctic Monkeys won, there probably weren't many people who came to like Arctic Monkeys who hadn't already bought the record. So I doubt if it had a very big effect. Whereas when, say, Elbow won, Elbow had always been on the sort of what you might call the second division of British rock, and it catapulted them into the first division without any doubt, because they just, they got attention to a much broader sort of rock audience. So I think depending on the act, it can make a very big difference. And occasionally you get an act, and although the point of the prize is to give them more publicity, you do that and find that people don't like them anyway, so it doesn't have quite the same effect. But then that's because we're judges who, we're not scientists trying to say what's the best record or what people like. We're trying to say, I always feel it's much more like being, I feel we're more like enthusiasts, boring people in a pub who grab hold of you and say, listen to this fucking record. And we try and do that in a sort of slightly less aggressive manner, and sometimes we're really pleased and people do, and somebody like, say, Anthony and the Johnsons, that transforms their careers. And other times people say, why?
Yeah, yeah. So, if you're looking back over your many years as chair of the judging panel at the
Yeah.
Mercury Prize, can you think of a band or a performer that you would have liked to have been nominated, who you think might be the one that got away, or?
I can think of ones that I love because I'm only one of many judges, and I don't usually necessarily. I'm always pretty happy with the winner, but I often have records that I would put on the shortlist, other people don't, and that will be very personal to me. So it's not particularly. I'm not particularly surprised. I think I'm sad that when we started, one of the things about Mercury, which needs stressing, is for all sorts of music. It's just any album that's been produced in the UK and Ireland in the previous 12 months. And when we started, we used to have quite a lot of contemporary classical music records on. But because of the way the classical music industry works, we hardly ever get any interest. So I'm sad about that. There's a kind of element of British music that's not there anymore. I'm also very sad that in 25 years I was never successful in getting a jazz record to win. Well, I think we've had really interesting jazz records, which are jazz in a very loose sense. And I would like to have seen that. So, but that's not getting on the list. That's just winning. Otherwise, I think not really. I mean, I think there's a certain sort of. Folk music, which is slightly older generation, established folk acts who are interesting. I think when we've had folk, we've tended to often get which is right because they're more experimental newcomers or young folk acts. And I sometimes think that's unfair. Folk music has a different kind of rhythm and how the musicians develop than other sort of areas. So whereas in rock, generally speaking, I kind of agree that bands' first 2 or 3 records tend to be better than their later records. I think that's not true in the folk world. So I think if it wouldn't be a particular person, but I think that would be the one area where I think we've been good to folk and they've done well, but I think there are some great folk artists who should have been on the list and haven't been.